Aquaman, swift and powerful monarch of the oceans, with ability to summon and command all creatures of the deep. Aquaman, who with his teenage ally, Aqualad, guards and defends all that lives in the seas against the forces of evil. Aquaman, King of the Seven Seas.
Aquaman is one of the few widely released superhero films of the last 15 years that I didn't see in theaters. I skipped Aquaman for several reasons, but the primary reason is that I really had a hard time caring about the film after Justice League, and Aquaman was never a character I cared about all that much, to be honest. On top of that, I knew I'd get a headache or have a seizure watching that in the theaters looking at the trailers. Eventually, I got a 4 for $20 deal on Vudu and ended up buying the film and subsequently watching it a couple weeks later. My initial reaction was that it wasn't particularly good or bad, mostly just bland and cheesy, which is unfortunate because I'm a big fan of James Wan and his work on horror, and even his Fast and Furious films was what I like to call cringe Kino, and it worked well for me.
Daddy's gotta go to work.
However, the film just felt really bland, and aside from a few moments of genuine cringe Kino, like when they play Pitbull's song,
Call the Sahara.
it was just mostly garbage. Anyhow, Aquaman as a character kind of has a tainted reputation, with his appearances in the Super Friends tainting his image over the years. I remember in the HBO show Entourage, they kept making jokes about the lead Vinny starring in James Cameron's Aquaman, which is multi-layered satire that is extra hilarious given the director's love of the ocean. Anyhow, while Entourage made jokes about the ridiculousness of an Aquaman film, Aquaman actually had a film in development as early as 2004, with Alan and Peter Ritchie at the helm. However, that would fall through in 2007. Aquaman again was considered for George Miller's infamous canceled Justice League film, but the role was never officially cast for the film as far as we know, at least publicly. Apparently, around 2009, Leonardo DiCaprio's production company, Apian, was talking about taking a crack at making an Aquaman film, but nothing ever came of this. In 2014, we finally got confirmation Aquaman was happening. This would eventually form into the film we got, with Jason Momoa at the head, along with James Wan directing. Peter Jackson was approached, but declined the offer. Aquaman follows Arthur Curry, who, not unlike Superman, is a man between worlds. He was born to Thomas Curry, a lighthouse keeper, in Atlanta, the Queen of Atlantis. After Atlanta was forced to move back to Atlantis and had another child, Arthur's half-brother Orm, Aquaman is sent on a quest with Mera to become the King of Atlantis to unite the Seven Kingdoms before Orm leads a ground invasion on the land that could wipe out the world. Along the way, they're forced to fight Black Manta, who has a bone to pick with Aquaman after the death of his father, which he blames on Aquaman because during a mission they were sent on by Orm to steal a nuclear submarine, Aquaman ends up inadvertently killing his father. As it turns out, the only way to unite the kingdoms is to become the King of Atlantis by proving his worthiness over Orm with his magical king staff, owned by Arthur's ancestor, Atlan's trident. When he finally comes to the trident, he finds his mother, Atlanta, was attempting to retrieve the trident for many years, with Arthur finally getting the trident and proving himself a worthy king. The three head back to Atlantis, where the sea is on the verge of a civil war, with Aquaman being forced to fight Orm in order to end the madness, save the earth, and take his rightful spot as the King of Atlantis, which will allow him to unite the sea and land and hopefully end the land-to-sea racism. Aquaman is still pretty unsure about where his allegiance lie. He is trained to be a warrior under the sea and on land, but not to the level of naval combat as his brother Orm, who hates him and wants to kill him. He's also coming off the Steppenwolf invasion, and since then has seemingly been doing superheroics, as seen when Aquaman foils the nuclear submarine hijacking that would become integral to the creation of his nemesis, Black Manta.
Permission to come aboard.
Ultimately, Aquaman becomes a reluctant chosen one after learning the only way for him to efficiently protect both land and ocean is to take his place as the King of Atlantis. I think Jason Momoa is pretty solid in the role of Aquaman. He's just running around having a great time. He's not winning any awards for his role, but he chews the scenery and it's solid enough, I suppose. Mira is looking to help Aquaman on his adventure, and the two eventually fall in love. They're an attractive couple of people, but I definitely don't think they have a ton of chemistry, and Amber Heard is really bad in this film.
You think you're unworthy to lead because you're of two different worlds. But that is exactly why you are worthy.
Well, I think the character is serviceable enough and makes for some really fun sequences throughout the film. I never really got into Mira as a character, and her only useful role in the film is adding someone to dump grueling amounts of exposition on Arthur as they weave between action scenes. David Kane becomes the Black Manta after the death of his father. He definitely gives off some Darth Vader vibes when he first invades the nuclear submarine at the start of the film. While he's a mercenary and a pirate, he eventually transitions wholly into a man on a revenge quest against Aquaman, after he blames the death of his father on our sea-bearing hero. Orm gives Black Manta some Atlantean tech, and when he confronts Aquaman in Sicily, he almost gets the best of the hero before being knocked off a cliff and landing in the water. However, he's rescued, and we see in the end credits that he's still alive and kicking, but we'll come back to that soon. I think Yuyak Abdullah Martin does a good job portraying the villain and gives a solid performance during the film. Like I said, his performance, especially in this first scene, gives off some serious Darth Vader vibes, with the submarine scene almost certainly being inspired by Vader's hijacking of the Tantive IV at the start of Star Wars. He's a good villain overall, and I'm excited to see more of him in the next installment. Orm wants to rule Atlantis and hates humanity in general, causing him to hate his half-brother Aquaman and everything he represents. The battle between Orm and Arthur will ultimately decide the fate of humanity, as if Arthur loses the conflict, then war will break out between Atlantis and humanity that will ultimately cause destruction of the world. I think the relationship between Arthur and Orm is interesting, and with the fate of the world hanging in the balance, I think the bureaucratic battle as well as the physical battles between the brothers make for a fairly interesting basis for a film. Patrick Wilson plays Orm pretty well and sells the villain role pretty well as well. That was a lot of wells. Watching him, I could have easily seen him playing a more old school version of Aquaman from before the more gruff version of the character Momoa's take was based on. He looks a lot like the character and gives a pretty good performance I think would also translate into a hero pretty easily. I'm sure that was an intentional choice when they were casting the character, and Wilson rarely plays a hard villain, previously working with Zack Snyder on the much more reserved Night Owl in Zack's interpretation of Watchmen. The cinematography of this film is definitely more of a Marvel House style look, being the least adventurous of the DCEU movies from a cinematography standpoint to date. However, they still do things to spice up the cinematography and make it work really well. The film was shot by Don Burgess, who worked on films like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. He also has second unit credits on Batman Returns, so he's kind of been in the superhero game a long time. He's worked in many different genres as well, working frequently with James Wan as well as Robert Zemeckis in multiple different roles. He has a lot of experience in the industry and shoots a pretty good looking film. More unique than some Marvel films, but still fairly easy to follow and coherent, and doesn't try anything too out of the ordinary like DC has done so far in the DCEU, with mixed results. Tonally, the film takes a bit from Marvel, but is a bit more nuanced. Momoa as Aquaman is more fun than quippy and outlandish. It kind of feels like a tones-down version of Pirates of the Caribbean or Star Wars, with this film tonally feeling a bit like the prequel films for Star Wars, in that it's very political, with goofy moments and fun action. It even has a tad bit of sentimentality for good measure. I'll probably get more into my prequel comparisons more later, but this film felt a lot like Star Wars to me in many senses, and I think in some ways is comparable to that film franchise. Let's talk about where the characters come from. Mera first appeared in Aquaman 11 and was originally from an alternate dimension called Dimension Aqua, before that origin was retconned to where she was just the queen of one of the 7 kingdoms of Atlantis. She has pretty well just been Aquaman's wife ever since her first appearance, often acting as part of his supporting cast along with Garth, the original Aqualad, and Jackson Hyde, the second Aqualad, who recently also took on the mantle of Aquaman in the comics. Vulko is Aquaman's mentor and was created in Brave and the Bold 73 and is a chief advisor to the throne of Atlantis. While William Dafoe's version may look significantly different, the idea of the character hasn't changed much since his conception. Ocean Master was created in Aquaman 29 and is the half-brother of Aquaman, who he tries to kill repeatedly to take Aquaman's throne, which is pretty much unchanged for the movie. He's one of Aquaman's primary antagonists. Nereus is a newer character to the DC continuity, being created in 2013 for Aquaman Volume 7 number 19 during the New 52, and quickly becoming a major player in the Aquaman film, played by Dolph Lundgren just a few years later. Black Manta first appeared in Aquaman 35, and despite coming out 27 years after the King of Atlantis himself, quickly became the character's most recognizable foe, and possibly the second most recognizable character attached to the Aquaman IP under Aquaman himself. In the comics, Black Manta had autism and had a fixation on the sea, which ultimately led him to become a ripped underwater mercenary, hell-bent on killing Aquaman. In the movie, he was just a pirate that watched his father die and became Black Manta to combat him. I think trying to fit in Black Manta's full origin would be hard to do within the realm of taste, so I'm fine with what they did. The music in this film isn't anything too high level, but I definitely think it's decent. Composed by Rupert Williams, the man who did Wonder Woman's music, I think more effort was put into this one than your average Wonder Woman track, or I at least think it works better with Aquaman than Wonder Woman. It sounded pretty angelic, with an almost Western influence, which was interesting. In fact, the sound design in general was very solid and very well mixed. This is something they must have had in mind, because I think it has more of an immersive soundtrack than your average DCEU film. At a few points, the album plays some tracks, most notably Ocean to Ocean by Pitbull,
always against all odds, like Pac said, I'm the living great Gatsby,
which bites the hook for Africa by Toto, and was a bizarre track to use, especially when they were flying over the Sahara Desert. Pitbull is putting a lot of effort into the song though, adding his traditional Pitbull flair and energy. I mostly just find the song to be funny, and it was an inside joke in my circle, even before I ever even saw the film. How they integrated it made it even funnier for me. Overall, I love the music, I love the sound design, I love Pitbull. Hell yeah. Kirk Morey edited the film. He works closely with James Wan, working on a handful of his films, including Aquaman and Malignant, as well as some other films that Wan produced. He started out working as an in-house editor for Jeopardy! The film is well edited for the most part. It's not super flashy, but it has some cool shots and transitions. One great example is when we see two different fights in Greece. One with Aquaman, then it does a quick zoom transition into what Mera is doing in the background. It's pretty slick and keeps up the pace while also adding scale and a good geographical understanding on what's happening in the scene. It might be one of the best moments in the film. Editing should be an invisible job, and the fact that Mori did that seamless transition, and specifically with this shot, also shows a lot of talent within the visuals department and also just the concept department. Very, very well done. The film is actually quite impressive in a lot of these aspects and actually hides a bunch of things you might not think about in the background, and it shows how in tune Wan was with his cinematography, editing, and effects staff, that even something like this 2-second shot could make it in, because it really took a lot from all three. Pretty cool stuff. In the end credits, we see Black Manta is alive and he was rescued by Stephen Shin, who's a conspiracy theorist who tracks Aquaman. This is setting up Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, which at the time I'm writing this is the yet to be released Aquaman sequel. I've since seen it. Don't worry, I'll be talking about that movie in this video as well. I just have a lot to write. Anyhow, Black Manta was... this is getting confusing. I wrote this so long ago. Anyhow, Black Manta will be the villain in the upcoming sequel, and this is set up for that film. Perhaps it was the airplane trapping me in a steel box hurling over the sky as I watched this on a 7-inch screen affixed to the seat in front of me, or it's the general lack of quality I endure during this marathon, but I think this film is kind of good. I can't believe I'm saying this, given the fact the film stars Aquaman, the pop culture punchline of DC. I don't mind the character in the comics, but bar a couple outstanding runs on Aquaman, he's always felt like a background character destined to fill out the roster of the Justice League. And I think this film could have easily felt like that. But James Wan definitely wanted to elevate the concept as much as it could possibly be elevated, while still making Aquaman a fun and cheeky character. Momoa is a badass in the film, but has a cheeky edge that tells me this is one of the fun DC films, and they were not going to try to elevate the movie much beyond being a fun adventure tale, which for a superhero movie shouldn't really be a bad thing, despite people kind of trying to turn their back on the superhero label lately. I don't mind some elevated storytelling, but for Aquaman to have a fun Dune, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings inspired kingdom epic with a fun edge isn't a bad thing, and Wan and the cast definitely knew that that was the angle they were coming at this film with. Speaking on inspirations, I slightly mentioned this movie having a handful of Star Wars parallels, as well, with Black Manta's reveal feeling a lot like Darth Vader when he enters the Tantum IV in the original film. Things like the underwater battles felt much like the ship battles from Star Wars. Amira's rescue of Aquaman after his initial duel with Orm felt a lot like the bigger fish Bongo escape from Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Even the politics are similarly explained by the Atlanteans to how the Star Wars people do it in the Star Wars prequels. And it has some unique and strong action scenes throughout, and all the leads and stunt people add such a physicality that works super well. The final Orm and Aquaman fight, when Aquaman finally gets his trident, also gives off some lightsaber duel vibes. Overall, the film feels like a really refined version of the Star Wars prequels. I'd be down to see James Wan do a Star Wars film for sure, because it felt like he definitely was inspired by those films. Like if we saw him do something set in the Clone Wars or something, that'd be pretty fun. I overall liked this film quite a bit, as you can tell, but I definitely think there were some weaker aspects of the film. For one, the underwater scenes take some getting used to. It's clearly just people standing in front of a green screen with some digital motion and a blue filter.
Your Majesty, there is no victory in defeating the ignorant. Your brother is clearly an imbecile.
I think some bubbles coming from the characters' mouths or something could have led to more convincing underwater scenes. But Wan did put thoughts into other aspects, like explaining that Atlanteans essentially have night vision that allows them to see when underwater, which adds some lore and proves Wan wanted to at least slightly explain some of the concepts that he knew people would nitpick. So I think the underwater stuff was going to be a bit of an uphill battle, no matter how you set it up, but they certainly did their best to try to make it work. The movie also loses a bit in the underwater scenes, and often looks much better when it's not in the ocean. The CGI occasionally looks really good and occasionally looks really scratchy. I think considering the amount of CG required to bring the world of Aquaman to life, and Warner Bros. Definitely not wanting to pay for those top of the line effects you see people like James Cameron implement, it does look okay. The film arguably also has too much exposition, which makes sense given the story they're trying to tell and the world they're trying to set up. And it's certainly less confusing than, say, Batman v Superman, but it's still pretty boring at points, with parts of the Greece scenes starting to weigh on me a bit. Wan does tactically try to piece it out with some really solid fights, but at points it doesn't feel like enough to really save the film from feeling bogged down by just loads of exposition. Overall, I actually really enjoyed Aquaman. It is by no means the best film I've ever seen, but I think it's pretty successful in what it's going for. I didn't love it the first time I saw it, but thought it was much better on this go around. From Aquaman's great reveal on the submarine down to the absurdly cheesy end speech, I was sold on this film from start to finish. Jason Momoa chews every scene he's in and seems to be having an absolute blast making this film, which makes me feel more like I'm having a blast. It makes the movies super digestible, especially when compared to something that's more bloated like Batman v Superman or the miserable Justice League film. As an action film, this movie has some of the most creative action in superhero cinema, with great physicality and lots of good editing and shot composition that keeps the action clear and legible. And even the larger lore stuff is well explained. It seems like a lot of thought was put into building the Seven Kingdoms of Atlantis. James Wan is one of the best pop filmmakers out there, always elevating projects while knowing how to make them wacky and fun. He's a filmmaking visionary and always adds new elements to franchises and knows how to make them on a high bar of quality with a decent story and knows how to market it to the mass audience, and I think that's what Aquaman did pretty brilliantly. This film is, in my opinion, much better than an Aquaman film has any right to be. Aquaman killed it at the box office, which is kind of a shock given America's perception of the characters, and after the utter failure of Justice League with a budget under $200 million, the film made $1.15 billion, which is a profit of a cool $650 to $700 million, making Aquaman the most commercially successful DCEU film. Critically, it ended up with a 65% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 55 out of 100 on Metacritic. It was praised for its energy and spectacle, but was criticized for its dialogue and plot. Overall, it was seen as an okay movie that was the most satisfying film yet when it came to spectacle. It was nominated for several awards, but nothing too prestigious, only ending up winning one award for the most popular film in America, in China, from the Chinese American Film Festival, making $300 million in China over its run, which is a big reason it made as much as it did, with a lot of these films not even playing in China. Clearly, the film connected with the people of China well, which ended up working pretty well for DC and was a big reason DC contracted Wan for another entry in the Aquaman franchise.
Mr. Worldwide.